In the 1950s, America lived with one eye on the sky. The Soviets had launched Sputnik in 1957, a polished sphere, no bigger than a beach ball, but its slow beeping across the heavens sent a tremor through every American classroom and war room. If they could send a satellite, what else could they send, and how fast? That was the question echoing in the halls of the Pentagon and in the quiet offices of scientists who had grown used to thinking about worst-case scenarios. One of them was a man named Joseph Karl Robnet Licklider, a psychologist and computer scientist at MIT. He had this curious, almost poetic idea. What if computers could help people think better? Not just crunch numbers, but share ideas. What if machines could talk to one another? By 1962, Licklider was working for ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, a branch of the Department of Defense born in the anxiety of the space race. And he was writing memos about something no one else had quite dreamed up, an intergalactic computer network. A little grand, maybe, but not wrong. His vision was simple in theory, but radical in implication, a decentralized system where information could flow between computers, not controlled by one single hub, but resilient, flexible, and fast. It was not just an academic dream. The military had begun to worry, what if a Soviet missile took out a key telephone exchange? What if traditional communication lines fell? The United States needed a way to keep its command lines open, even under attack. And so, behind government doors and chalk-dusted university labs, a new kind of project began to take shape. Not a weapon, not a rocket, but something quieter, a way to move data across space so that no message would be lost to a bomb or to time. No one quite knew where it would lead. But in that uneasy decade, with bomb shelters in backyards and children practicing duck-and-cover drills at school, a handful of people were already imagining a different kind of survival. Not through firepower, but through connection. The Cold War sparks, a networked idea. In the years after World War II, America stood tall, but never quite at ease. By the 1950s, the Cold War had settled over the world like a gray and humming fog. It was not a war of soldiers in trenches or bombs over cities. It was subtler, more anxious, a chess match of ideologies and arsenals played out in laboratories, newsrooms, and silent missile silos. And then, in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. It was just a small silver ball, 184 pounds of polished metal, and beeping radio signals. But when it passed over the American sky, it set off something deeper than panic. It stirred the feeling that we had been caught looking the wrong way, dreaming of cars and television, while another superpower reached for space. The reaction in Washington was swift. The Eisenhower administration poured money into science and technology. That same year, the Department of Defense created a new agency, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. Its mission was simple: to prevent the next technological surprise. And that surprise, many feared, might come not from the sky, but from under the ground. Military planners were grappling with a terrifying question. What if the Soviets launched a nuclear strike not to destroy cities, but to wipe out our communication lines? America's entire defense system, its command and control, was built on centralized networks, telephone switches, radar hubs, early computers all linked by wires, and vulnerable points. Knock out a few, and the rest could fall like dominoes. At Rand Corporation, a government-funded think tank in California, a man named Paul Baran began thinking in a different direction. Instead of building stronger central hubs, what if we eliminated the hubs entirely? What if data moved in small packets across a web of connected nodes, where even if some nodes were destroyed, the message could still find another path? It was radical, It was messy, and it went against decades of engineering orthodoxy. But Baran believed it could work. He published a series of papers in the early 1960s proposing a new kind of communication system, one that was decentralized, redundant, and nearly impossible to kill. Around the same time, back at MIT, another mind was at work on a similar vision. Joseph Carl Robnet Licklider. Lick, to his friends, was not a military man. He was a psychologist by training, a computer scientist by curiosity, and something of a dreamer. He believed that computers could be more than number crunchers. They could be companions in thought, partners in creativity. He imagined a future where people and machines worked together in real time across great distances. In 1962, Licklider joined ARPA and became the first head of its Information Processing Techniques office. From there, he began championing a strange, sprawling idea he called the Intergalactic Computer Network. The name was half joke, half prophecy. What he meant was simple: a future where computers everywhere could talk to each other. Licklider saw that such a network could solve both military and civilian problems. For the Pentagon, it meant survivable communication. For scientists, it meant collaboration across universities and labs. For everyday people, though few saw it, then it meant something far more revolutionary. But at that moment, it was all still theory. The hardware was primitive. Computers were the size of refrigerators and cost more than houses. They were isolated, incompatible, and mostly owned by universities or the military. Even so, the seeds were being planted. In 1965, a scientist named Lawrence Roberts, also at RPE, conducted an experiment linking a computer in Massachusetts with one in California using a telephone line. It was slow, clunky, and prone to errors, but it worked. It proved that information could travel across distance from machine to machine, like a conversation. ARPA began funding research at universities across the country: UCLA, Stanford, UCSB, and the University of Utah, each a node in what would soon become something greater than the sum of its parts. Back then, no one called it the Internet. That word had not yet been born. But in dusty offices and humming labs, men and women were sketching out the first outlines of what would one day wrap around the world. They were not trying to change history. They were just trying to solve a problem. Yet that is how most change begins. You could say it started with fear, with the threat of bombs and a desire for survival. But you could also say it started with hope, with minds that looked past the fear and saw possibility instead. People like Baran and Licklider, who imagined a world where connection was not a weakness, but a strength. It would take years for their ideas to become real, and longer still for those ideas to reach into ordinary homes, classrooms, and pockets. But in the early 1960s, in the long shadow of a world divided by ideology and armed to the teeth, a new kind of map was being drawn, not of borders or missiles, but of links and nodes and circuits that could not be silenced. And even now, looking back, through all the noise and brightness of today's online world, you can still see the outline of those first quiet hopes. The first Internet message, UCLA, 1969. In the fall of 1969, while the rest of America was still echoing from Woodstock and the moon landing, a different kind of history was unfolding in a quiet room on the campus of UCLA. It did not look like much. Just a pair of bulky computers connected by a long phone line, stretching from Los Angeles to Stanford Research Institute some 350 miles north. There were no grand speeches, no cameras, just a few graduate students, some thick manuals, and the gentle whir of machines the size of refrigerators. And yet, what happened there on the evening of October 29th would become the first breath of what we now call the Internet. The project was called ARPANET, funded by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and it had a singular goal: to create a network that could connect computers at research universities across the country. Not just to send files, but to share computing power. If UCLA had a program and Stanford had the data, the two machines could work together. In theory. But in practice, things were far less certain. The team at UCLA was led by Leonard Kleinrock, a computer scientist who had helped develop the theory behind packet switching, a method of breaking up data into chunks and sending them independently like postcards, rather than one continuous stream like a phone call. That night, a student named Charlie Klein sat at the keyboard ready to attempt the first login over the network. His task was simple: log into the computer at Stanford by typing the word login. He typed the first letter L, then O, then crash. The system at Stanford went down before he could type the G. But those two letters, L and O, were enough. The message had traveled from one computer to another across hundreds of miles, not by radio, not by satellite, but by a new kind of digital thread. They had tried again later. It worked. Login went through. The connection held. But history remembers that first stumble, the moment the world's first internet message became LO. Some have joked that it was like the network was trying to say hello. A fitting accident, perhaps, as if the internet itself was blinking awake, unsure of what it would become. In truth, it was the culmination of years of theory and experiment, and it was just the beginning. After UCLA and Stanford, other universities joined the network: UC Santa Barbara, the University of Utah. By the end of 1969, ARPANET had 4 nodes. It does not sound like much, but it was enough. The network was growing, not just in size, but in potential. And what made ARPANET different from other networks was how it moved information. Traditional communication relied on circuit switching. Dedicated lines opened between 2 points, like a phone call. If the line broke, the call ended. But ARPANET used packet switching. Data was broken into pieces, each with its own address, and sent across whatever paths were available. If one path failed, another could take its place. It was more like a postal system than a telephone. That design made ARPANET robust, and it laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Still, in 1969, almost no one outside the research world noticed. Computers were still rare and expensive. The ARPANET was a curiosity, a tool for scientists. There were no websites, no browsers, no email yet. Just commands and code, typed in glowing green letters on black screens. But within those limitations, something powerful was beginning to stir. Researchers started sharing data across campuses. Files that once took days to mail could be transmitted in seconds. Programs could be run remotely. Knowledge flowed faster. And with each new node, the network grew stronger, not linearly, but exponentially. The Department of Defense, which had funded ARPANET with military resilience in mind, watched as universities used it for something softer, but no less strategic: collaboration. In the years that followed, new tools were developed to navigate this growing network. By 1971, a man named Ray Tomlinson would send the first email using the now familiar error symbol to route messages. But in 1969, it was still just raw connection, a whisper between machines. And yet, for the handful of people who witnessed it, the feeling was unmistakable. Something had changed. Leonard Kleinrock would later describe the moment as the birth of a new era, an era not just of computation, but of communication. The idea that distance no longer had to mean disconnection, that minds could meet not in person, but through code. It was not flashy, it was not televised, but it was real. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about history. The moments that shape the future often arrive without fanfare. They unfold in back rooms and side labs with people who are just trying to make something work. But those two letters, L and O, were a door cracking open. And behind it was a different kind of world. A world not yet imagined, not yet named, but one that would soon find its way into every classroom, every kitchen, every hand. And it all began with a failed login. A blink, a whisper between machines on a quiet night in 1969. The 1970s TCP/IP and the foundations of a common language. By the early 1970s, ARPANET was growing, but it was still a fragile thing. The first few nodes had proven that computers could talk across long distances, but the conversation was limited, like trying to speak to someone in a language only the two of you knew. Each computer system had its own way of formatting data, its own rules for communication. Connecting them was less like building a telephone system, and more like trying to translate a dozen dialects in real time, all without a shared dictionary. What the network needed now was a common language. Enter two men, Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn. Kahn had joined ARPA in 1972 after working on the design of packet radio networks. He believed that ARPANET was only the beginning, that computers in different kinds of networks, even ones on satellites or radio waves, should be able to talk to each other. But that would require something new, a protocol that could work, no matter what the underlying hardware or network looked like. Cerf then, a computer scientist at Stanford, had worked on ARPANET's early architecture. He understood the complexity of machines trying to speak across formats. When Kahn approached him with the idea of a more universal protocol, Cerf saw its potential immediately. Together they began to draft something bold. It was not just a better way to send data. It was a system that treated all networks equally wired wireless, big, small, as peers. It would package information into packets, label them clearly, send them off independently, and let the receiving machine reassemble them in the correct order. They called it TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. TCP would make sure that packets got through in the right order, without loss. IP would handle the addressing, telling each packet where to go and how to get there. It was a clean division of labor, and it worked. In December 1974, Cerf and Kahn published their design in a paper titled A Protocol for Packet Network Intercommunication. It was dense, technical, and visionary. The world would not change overnight. But in those pages was the foundation of everything that would follow. Throughout the mid and late 1970s, small teams at universities and research institutions began implementing versions of TCP/IP. It was not always easy. The existing ARPANET protocols still functioned, and many resisted change. But the need for something more flexible was becoming clearer with each new kind of network that emerged. Meanwhile, the number of ARPANET nodes kept growing. By 1973, there were more than 30 locations on the network, including some outside the United States, linking London and Norway to American institutions. The idea that data could flow across continents without needing permission from phone companies or governments was quietly revolutionary, and the uses of the network were expanding. Email, once a side project, became the most popular application on ARPANET almost overnight. Researchers began sending messages, updates, even jokes across the wire. What had started as a system for sharing computing power became something more human, a place to talk to, argue, to connect. There were growing pains, of course. Some nodes crashed, software mismatches caused confusion, and not everyone agreed on the future. Should the network stay under military oversight? Should it be opened to the public? Could it be misused? But through it all, TCP/IP kept moving forward, refined, tested, debated, rewritten. By 1977, the first successful demonstration of TCP/IP working across 3 different kinds of networks, satellite radio and ARPANET, was completed. The packet moved seamlessly through each one, unbothered by the differences beneath it. It was in a way the first true Internet. Still few outside the research community noticed. The machines were still massive, the interfaces unfriendly. To connect, you needed technical knowledge, special access, and a lot of patience. There were no images, no colors, no hyperlinks, just glowing green text on dark screens. It was a place for engineers, scientists, and curious graduate students. But something deeper was happening. With each new university that joined, with each protocol that got standardized, the network was becoming less of a patchwork and more of a fabric. Invisible, but present. Not just a project, but an infrastructure. Vinton Cerf would later compare the effort to building a cathedral, slow collaborative spanning years, even decades. Each line of code, each decision, laid with the hope that others would build upon it. And while the public would not hear the word Internet for years to come, the foundation had already been poured. In quiet labs and humming server rooms, packets flowed, ideas moved. A new geography was taking shape, not of land and borders, but of nodes and links, protocols, and trust. It would take another decade for the world to notice. But in the 1970s, without headlines or ribbon cuttings, the Internet began learning how to speak, not with a single voice, but with a shared set of rules. And once a common language exists, anything becomes possible. 1983. The day the Internet was born, by the start of the 1980s. ARPANET was no longer an experiment. It was a living, breathing system. Researchers across dozens of universities and military installations logged in daily. They sent emails, transferred files, ran remote programs. For them, the network was already part of everyday life. But underneath the surface, a transformation was coming. The old protocols that had powered ARPANET, things like NCP or Network Control Protocol, were becoming strained. They worked, but only within that specific network. As other networks emerged, each with their own rules, the dream of linking them all together started to feel more urgent. That dream had a name now: Internet working. And the protocols that would make it possible, TCP/IP, had matured. Throughout the late 1970s, programmers and engineers had been refining them, testing them, deploying them in small pockets of the ARPANET world. But change does not come easily to systems already in motion. Most users were comfortable with NCP. Replacing it would mean rewriting code, retraining users, and risking disruption across the entire network. Still, the benefits were clear. TCP/IP allowed for modular design, better error correction, and most importantly, communication between vastly different types of networks. If this was going to be more than ARPANET, if this was going to be a true Internet, then the switch had to be made. So the planners set a date, January 1st, 1983. It sounds almost ceremonial now, but it was anything but. The transition was massive, technical, and fraught with anxiety. Throughout 1982, network administrators worked feverishly to prepare. Software had to be rewritten. Manuals had to be distributed. Machines had to be updated and tested, often by people who had never touched TCP/IP before. And then, on that cold January morning, it happened. At 12:01 a.m., the old NCP protocol was turned off across the ARPANET. All hosts were expected to have switched to TCP/IP. There was no backup plan. It was, in the words of some engineers, a flag day, a moment when everything had to change at once. Some machines failed. Some links went dark. But remarkably, the core of the network held. And just like that, ARPANET became the Internet. Not in name, most users still referred to it as ARPANET, but in function. For the first time, disparate networks could talk to each other using the same universal protocol. Universities, research labs, military bases, and even some early commercial entities were now part of the same digital fabric. The shift marked a philosophical change as well. Before 1983, ARPANET was a walled garden. After 1983, the gates were open. The architecture encouraged growth, flexibility, and decentralization. It no longer mattered what kind of computer you had, what operating system you ran, or what network you were on. If you spoke TCP/IP, you were part of the conversation, and the conversation was growing louder. New networks began to bloom. CSNET connected computer science departments. BitNet linked universities. NSFNet, the National Science Foundation network, soon followed, bringing high-speed connections to more campuses and research centers across the country. These networks, each with their own origin stories, were now part of a broader web stitched together by shared protocols and a growing sense of purpose. The word Internet began to surface more often, not as a theoretical idea, but as a practical tool. It was still small by today's standards, used mostly by academics and specialists. But its shape was beginning to resemble something familiar. And more importantly, it was no longer just a technical system, it was a culture. Users created mailing lists to discuss topics ranging from astrophysics to science fiction. Early netiquette rules emerged. A sense of digital community began to form, one not bound by geography, but by shared interest. Of course, this new world had its quirks. Addresses were still managed manually. Most domain names did not exist yet. If you wanted to email someone, you had to know exactly where their computer lived on the network. There was no Google, no search bar, no graphics, but there was wonder. Because for the first time in history, knowledge could move without friction, without borders, without delay. And that was not lost on those who were watching closely. In Washington, policymakers began to notice. In Silicon Valley, a generation of tinkerers began to imagine new possibilities. In high schools and hobbyist clubs, kids with access to terminals started dialing in, poking around, seeing what they could find. The foundation had been laid. The infrastructure was spreading, but the world had not yet caught up. Most Americans in 1983 still knew nothing of TCP/IP or of the digital revolution unfolding behind the scenes. They went about their lives with rotary phones and newspapers, unaware that the first threads of a global web were quietly wrapping around them. Looking back now, it is tempting to mark January 1st, 1983, as the day everything changed. And in some ways, it was. But no headlines proclaimed it. No sirens sounded. The transformation came as so many do in silence. A quiet migration of bits and packets, a handoff from one idea to another. And in that stillness, something vast began to wake. The 1980s domain names and the expanding net. In the years after the Great Switch of 1983, the Internet began to stretch its limbs. It was no longer just ARPANET's younger cousin. It had become something larger, more adaptable, more open. Thanks to TCP/IP networks across disciplines and continents, could finally speak the same language. The groundwork was there. What the Internet needed now was identity. Because even in a world of machines, names matter. In those early days, trying to reach another computer across the network was like trying to find someone in a crowded city with only a zip code. You had to know a string of numbers, the IP address, something like 192.5.5.2241. And if that machine changed location or network, that address could change too. It was clunky, unreliable, and nearly impossible to scale. What the Internet needed was a phone book, something that could translate human-readable names like Harvard, EDU, or NASA, Gov, into the precise numbers that machines understood. So, in 1983, a group of researchers led by Paul Mockapetris proposed a solution, the domain name system, DNS. It was elegant, really. Instead of forcing users to memorize numbers, DNS introduced a hierarchical naming structure. At the top were familiar suffixes, .com, .edu, .gov, .org, and so on. Beneath them, organizations could register domain names, custom labels that would map to their servers. And behind the curtain, a system of name servers quietly did the translation work, routing each request to the correct machine. DNS went live in 1985. The first domain name ever registered was symbolics.com, a computer manufacturer based in Massachusetts. That same year, just 6 domains were registered. But by the end of the decade, that number would explode. Because once names were easier, everything became easier. Universities launched websites. Government agencies created portals. Commercial firms started experimenting with digital storefronts long before e-commerce was a buzzword. The network was becoming easier to use, and as it did, more people wanted in. At the same time, institutions outside of the original military and academic spheres were beginning to connect. NSFNet, the National Science Foundation network, emerged as a new backbone for the growing Internet. It was faster than ARPANET and, more importantly, open to non-defense users. Launched in 1985, it would eventually overtake ARPANET in scale and influence. Throughout the 1980s, NSFNet laid high-speed connections between supercomputing centers across the United States. These centers, in turn, linked to regional and local networks, bringing small colleges, research institutions, and even some public schools into the fold. And as access expanded, so did culture. The first Internet communities were born, text-only discussion forums called newsgroups, organized under a system known as Usenet. These forums covered every imaginable topic from science to politics to Star Trek. Messages were posted in plain text, often with no moderation, and then distributed across participating servers. It was chaotic, democratic, and strangely addictive. One user described it as the world's biggest dorm room argument. Another simply called it freedom. There was no advertising, no algorithms, just words, millions of them typed out by curious, lonely, brilliant, frustrated people scattered across the globe. And as the network grew, so did its risks. In 1988, the Internet experienced its first major security crisis. A graduate student named Robert Tappan Morris, son of a prominent computer scientist, released what he claimed was an academic experiment, a self-replicating program designed to measure the size of the Internet. But due to a coding error, the program, later known as the Morris worm, began infecting machines, uncontrollably clogging servers, slowing traffic, and causing widespread disruptions. It was the first wake-up call. Suddenly, the Internet was no longer just a tool for connection. It was an environment that could be attacked, exploited, misused. The worm infected roughly 6,000 computers, which at the time represented about 10% of the entire Internet. It led to the formation of the first Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT, and sparked national conversations about cybersecurity, digital ethics, and legal responsibility. Still, the growth did not stop. By the end of the 1980s, the number of hosts connected to the Internet had surpassed $100,000. Email had become commonplace among scientists and researchers. FTP servers housed growing archives of public files. And somewhere in Switzerland, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was thinking about how to link documents together, though his idea would not reach the world until the next decade. But for now, the 1980s were about expansion. The net was no longer a fragile experiment. It was infrastructure. It was communication. It was discovery. And even though it still required technical skill to access terminal windows, command lines, user permissions, The number of those who could do so was rising fast. Hobbyist groups formed. Students tinkered. Engineers dreamed. There was still no color, no images, no video, no Google, no Facebook, no online shopping carts. But there was unmistakably a feeling. The feeling that the world was changing not on television, not in some distant capital, but inside the wires. That human knowledge had found a new vessel, that voices could travel without borders, that something vast, unseen, and profoundly human was starting to take shape. And it all began with a simple change names instead of numbers. Tim Berners-Lee and the birth of the World Wide Web. It began with a frustration. In 1989, at a quiet research laboratory on the outskirts of Geneva, Switzerland, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee sat in his office at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, staring at a growing problem. CERN was home to thousands of scientists, many working on complex experiments that generated mountains of data. Some were based on site. Others worked remotely spread across the globe. They used different machines, different software, and stored information in different places. Finding anything, datasets, research notes, experiment logs, was a headache. Connecting them nearly impossible. Tim wanted something better. What he envisioned was not a new network. The internet already existed, but it lacked structure, lacked simplicity. To most people, it was a jumble of protocols, commands, and obscure addresses. Useful, yes, but intuitive, not even close. So he proposed something deceptively simple, a system to link information across the internet using hypertext. His March 1989 proposal was titled Information Management, a Proposal. It was dry, cautious, and largely ignored at first. But his boss at CERN scribbled one encouraging note on the cover. Vague, but exciting. Tim pressed on. He began developing a way to combine three key elements: hypertext, the internet, and a universal addressing system. The idea was to give every document, every image, every piece of information its own unique location, a uniform resource locator, a URL. To pull it off, he created three new tools. First was HTML, the hypertext markup language, a way to format documents that could contain text images, and most importantly, links. Next came HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, a way for computers to request and deliver these documents across a network. And finally, he built the world's first web browser, called World Wide Web, later renamed Nexus. It was simple, black text on a white screen, no colors, no buttons, but it worked. By the end of 1990, Tim had launched the first website, infocern.ch. Its purpose was humble, to explain what the World Wide Web was and how others could join. There was no fanfare, no news headlines, no viral posts, because none of that existed yet. But in a dim office in Switzerland, a doorway had been opened, and slowly people began to step through. In 1991, CERN released the code to the public. It was free, open, and designed for anyone with internet access to use. A few scientists and engineers downloaded it, tinkered with it, and began building their own pages. Then came the ripple. New web browsers appeared, Airways, Viola, Cello. More websites emerged. Universities hosted directories. Researchers published online papers. Enthusiasts started making homepages, little corners of the web, dedicated to hobbies, jokes, music lyrics, and cat pictures. The experience of using the internet began to change. Before, the web, accessing information online meant knowing exact file paths, using obscure commands, and often connecting directly to remote machines. It was efficient but intimidating. With the web, information could be clicked. Instead of typing FTP 123.456789 pub docs report.txt, you could now click on a blue word that simply said research summary. The machine would take care of the rest. It sounds trivial now. Back then, it felt like magic. Tim Berners-Lee never tried to profit from the web. He refused to patent the technologies behind it. He believed the web belonged to everyone, and that decision, perhaps more than any code he wrote, shaped what followed, because it meant the web could grow. By the end of 1991, there were only a handful of websites in the world. By the end of 1992, there were dozens. In 1993, hundreds. By 1994, thousands. And by the end of the decade, millions. The web took the internet from something you accessed to something you experienced. And though it would still take a few more years before the average household caught on, the foundation had been laid. Every hyperlink was a thread, every browser window a portal. Knowledge once scattered and siloed was now something you could navigate. It is easy to forget how fragile it all was. In 1991, most internet users still connected by modem, through screeching, buzzing dial-up lines. A single image could take minutes to load. Videos were unthinkable. There were no search engines, no bookmarks of bookmarks. But there was possibility. Tim's vision had not been to build a library. He had built something more radical, a canvas. One that anyone could paint on, and everyone could explore. It was not just about sharing information. It was about weaving it together. The web was the perfect name. And like any web, it grew in silence, strand by strand across the world. The first web browsers, Mosaic, Netscape, and the Internet's first boom. By the early 1990s, the World Wide Web existed, but few people knew it. It was still a niche tool, mostly confined to universities and government labs. You had to install software by hand, know a bit of code, and even then there was not much to see. The web was real, but it was quiet. That began to change in 1993. At the University of Illinois, a group of young developers working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, were trying to solve a simple problem. How do you make the web easier to use? They built a program. It was called Mosaic. What made Mosaic different was not its technology. Most of its parts were based on Tim Berners-Lee's early work, but its design. Mosaic was friendly. It had a graphical interface. You could see images in line with text. There were menus, buttons, scroll bars. For the first time, you could browse the web the way you might flip through a magazine. It launched in January 1993. Within weeks, downloads exploded. Word spread through bulletin boards, newsgroups, dorm rooms. People were stunned. There were no pop-ups, no autoplay videos, just information linked together, clickable and visual. It felt like science fiction. And for many, it was the first time the internet felt real. One of Mosaic's developers, Mark Andreessen, was just 22 years old when the project took off. But he understood what they had created. He saw that this was not just a research tool, it was the future of communication, commerce, and culture. That same year, Andreessen moved to Silicon Valley and joined forces with tech entrepreneur Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics. Together, they formed a company called Mosaic Communications, which would later change its name to Netscape. Their first product, a new browser, Netscape Navigator. Launched in late 1994, it was faster, sleeker, and more powerful than Mosaic. But more than that, it came with a new vision that the web was for everyone, not just scientists, not just students, everyone. Netscape was free for individuals and nonprofits. Its installation was simple, its interface was clean, and it worked across platforms Windows, Mac, Unix. Within months, it became the dominant browser in the world. By early 1995, Netscape claimed more than 70% of the web browser market, and with it came a wave. Websites began appearing everywhere. Newspapers, bookstores, weather stations, personal pages, pages for pets, for hobbies, for jokes, for poems. The web was no longer a thing you accessed in a lab. It was something you explored from your kitchen table if you were lucky enough to have a modem. The phrase surfing the web became part of the cultural lexicon. People spent hours clicking from one page to another, following links like breadcrumbs through an endless forest. There were no rules, no roadmaps, just curiosity. But the boom was not just personal, it was economic. Investors saw what Netscape had built and sensed something big. The web was not just a playground, it was a platform, a market, a new frontier. In August 1995, Netscape went public. The company's stock price doubled on the first day in what became one of the most famous IPOs in history. Netscape had never turned a profit, and yet its valuation soared into the billions. For many, it was the first signal that the internet was not just a fad, it was the future. Silicon Valley responded quickly. Startups formed overnight. Venture capital poured in. Entrepreneurs launched companies with little more than an idea and a domain name. Terms like .com and e-business entered everyday speech. And with every new browser download, the audience grew. By the end of 1995, there were more than 16 million internet users worldwide, up from just 3 million 2 years before. The number of websites passed 100,000, and companies like Yahoo and Amazon were just getting started. The web had gone from a backroom project to a global phenomenon in less than 3 years. But behind all the excitement, something else was happening. The web was becoming normal. Children began using it to do homework. Parents used it to check the weather. Teachers built classroom pages. Artists shared their work. For the first time, people were encountering information outside of traditional gatekeepers, outside of libraries, publishers, broadcasters. The power dynamic was shifting, and though few realized it at the time, the tools for the next century were quietly being assembled, one homepage at a time. Of course, not everything was golden. Many early websites were slow, buggy, or broken. Dial-up connections were still the norm, complete with screeching handshakes and busy signals. And navigating the web was often a mess. There were no good search engines, yet just directories and guesswork. But none of that seemed to matter, because for the first time in history, the average person could publish something that anyone anywhere could see. It was democratization on a scale never before imagined. And at the center of it all, glowing on CRT monitors across the world, was a little program with a blue N in the corner, Netscape Navigator, inviting people into the web like a lantern in the dark. The commercial web, Amazon, Yahoo, and the dot-com dream. By 1995, the internet was no longer a secret. What had started as a research experiment, then a scientist's playground, had now become a doorway into something much larger, something louder. The web was growing fast. But what happened in 1995 marked a shift so dramatic, so permanent, that many would later say it was the year the internet truly arrived. Because 1995 was the year the internet went commercial. Until that point, much of the internet's backbone, especially NSFNet, had been government-funded with restrictions on commercial use. You could browse email research, even build a website, but you could not run a business on it. Not officially. That changed on April 30, 1995, when the National Science Foundation decommissioned NSFNet as the primary internet backbone, opening the door for private providers. The web was now open for business, and business came fast. That summer, a skinny man with a wide grin named Jeff Bezos launched a small online bookstore called Amazon.com from his garage in Seattle. His goal to build the everything store. But for now, it was just books. He had picked books for a reason. They were standardized, easy to ship, endless in variety. And the web, with its vast potential for catalogs and personalization, was the perfect vehicle. Customers could browse titles, read reviews, and click to buy all without leaving home. It felt futuristic. It felt magical. But Amazon was not alone. Another young company, Yahoo, had started a year earlier as a humble directory of websites curated by hand. In a time before reliable search engines, Yahoo was like a map maker for a digital frontier. Its homepage listed links by category: news, sports, science, weird stuff, and users loved it. In 1995, Yahoo became a full-fledged company, hired its first CEO, and moved to Silicon Valley. Its traffic soared. Advertisers took notice. Money followed. And suddenly, every corner of the web began buzzing with activity. New companies launched daily, many with odd names and big dreams: eBay, Excite, Lycos, GeoCities. They sold things, connected people, offered news photos, auctions, chat rooms. Most were free to use. They just wanted traffic, eyeballs, attention. Because the business model in those early days was not about profit. It was about growth. Get big fast became a mantra. So did first mover advantage. If you could capture users, revenue would eventually follow, or so everyone believed. And venture capitalists, caught up in the euphoria, poured money into anything with a .com at the end of its name. Office parks in Northern California swelled with startups. Nap pods and ping-pong tables appeared beside server racks. Job listings offered stock options instead of salaries. Billboards popped up along the highways advertising websites with no explanation, just a name and a logo. And through it all, users kept coming. Because the web in 1995 was exciting. It was full of color, of sound, of motion. Websites had spinning logos and flashing GIFs, guest books and hit counters, under construction signs that never seemed to go away. Most were crude by today's standards, but they had a kind of charm, built not by corporations, but by people with a keyboard, an internet connection, and an idea. And beneath the novelty, something real was happening. People were buying things online, not just books, but plane tickets, CDs, flowers, toys. For the first time, commerce was escaping the mall and moving on to the modem. The web was becoming a marketplace, and it was reshaping expectations. Shoppers began to demand tracking numbers, same-day updates, real-time support. In a sense, the early commercial web did not just change how people bought it, changed what people expected from businesses. Instant answers, endless variety, personalized recommendations. The old world was slow. The new world was clickable. But the speed brought risk. Some startups rushed products to market without testing. Some overpromised and underbuilt. Some were just scams. And while investors were giddy and users were curious, not everyone understood how fragile it all was. Because under the surface, many companies had no revenue, no plan, just hope. Still, 1995 felt like a celebration. The web had gone from curiosity to necessity. Colleges advertised their URLs on campus tours. Magazines printed web addresses in their margins. News anchors began saying, "Visit us online." Even President Clinton got a website, whitehouse.gov. That year, Java was introduced, letting web pages become interactive. Internet Explorer launched, beginning what would become the infamous browser wars with Netscape. Microsoft bundled it with Windows. Lawsuits would follow. But in that moment, it felt like expansion. A digital gold rush. And yet, for all the noise, all the venture capital, all the IPOs and stock tickers and flashing ads, the thing that people loved most was still the feeling of reaching out, of discovering a new website, of getting an email from someone across the world, of finding something you did not know you were looking for. It was a kind of digital wandering, and in 1995 there was still so much space left unexplored. AOL dial-up and the sound of first connection. If you were online in the 1990s, chances are you remember the sound. It began with a click, then a long pause, then a burst of static that sounded like a robot choking on marbles. High-pitched beeps, a few chirps, and finally, if you were lucky, a steady hum, a small light on the modem, blinking into life. You were connected. That sound, strange, mechanical, unforgettable, was the soundtrack of a generation stepping into the internet for the very first time. And for millions of Americans, that first connection came through one name, AOL, America Online. It began in the 1980s as a company called Quantum Computer Services. Back then, it offered dial-up access to Commodore 64 users and a few primitive online games. But in 1989, it rebranded as AOL and set out with a new mission to make the internet easy. And they meant it. AOL came on a disk, sometimes a floppy, later a CD-ROM. You found them everywhere, inside magazines, in mailboxes, even tucked between cereal boxes. Each one offered a few hundred free hours of internet, like a coupon for a digital world. You slid the disk in, installed the software, typed in a username, and suddenly you were online. Sort of. In truth, AOL was not the internet, not at first. It was a walled garden, a self-contained platform with its own content, news, weather, chat rooms, email, message boards. It had its own browser, its own graphics, its own vocabulary. You did not go online. You signed on. You did not check your email. You waited to hear, "You've got mail." And people loved it. By the mid-1990s, AOL had become the most popular online service in America. It brought grandparents, middle schoolers, and first-time computer owners onto the web, people who would have been too intimidated by Unix prompts or TCP/IP settings. AOL made it feel safe. There were parental controls, easy billing, customer support, bright buttons, a home page that looked like a digital newspaper. You could join a chat room about gardening or jazz or Star Trek. You could meet strangers, make friends, even fall in love. For many, AOL was the internet. But behind the scenes, things were changing. In 1995, AOL began offering full internet access, letting users visit websites outside of its walled garden. Slowly, the gates opened. And once people stepped beyond, they did not want to go back. The open web was bigger, wilder, messier, but it was also more exciting. AOL adapted. It offered better browsers, faster connections, more services, and it kept growing. By 1997, AOL had over 8 million subscribers. A year later, it was 16 million. At its peak, 1 out of every 2 American homes with internet used AOL. It had become the front door to the online world. But dial-up was still dial-up. You had to choose between using the phone and using the internet because both ran on the same line. You had to wait. Connections dropped. Speeds were slow. A single image might take 30 seconds to load. A song, forget it. And yet those limitations created their own kind of ritual. You did not just hop online. You planned it. You sat down with a purpose to write an email, browse a site, join a chat room. Then you logged off. There was no background browsing, no scrolling in bed, no notifications popping up in the middle of dinner. The internet was a place you visited, not a place you lived in. And AOL was the train that took you there. It became more than a brand, it was a part of daily life. The name was printed on mugs, on mousepads, on backpacks. It advertised during the Super Bowl. It sponsored concerts, launched magazines, produced original content. In 1998, it even acquired Netscape, the once mighty web browser that had kick-started the internet boom. Then, in 2000, something unthinkable happened. AOL announced it was merging with Time Warner, one of the largest media companies in the world. The deal, worth over $180 billion, was hailed as the start of a new era, where old media and new media would finally unite. But the future had other plans. Broadband was coming. fast, always-on connections that made dial-up look like a horse-drawn carriage. Younger users no longer needed AOL to guide them. They had Internet Explorer, Google, Yahoo, Napster. The walled garden had served its purpose. Now it felt like a fence. And as users left, so did the magic. AOL's subscriber base began to shrink. The software grew bloated. The company, once a pioneer, now struggled to keep up. By the end of the decade, the merger with Time Warner was considered one of the worst in corporate history. But for all its rise and fall, AOL left a mark. It brought the Internet to the masses not as a line of code, but as a friendly face. It made the online world feel less like a network and more like a neighborhood. And that sound, the dial tone, the handshake, the static burst still lives in the memory of millions. Because it was not just a connection to the web, it was a moment. The first time you saw a web page. The first time you chatted with a stranger in Kansas. The first time you realized that the world was bigger, closer, and far more interesting than you had ever imagined. All from a beige box, with a blinking light, and a voice that said, "You've got mail." When the Internet moved into the American home. By 1996, the Internet was no longer something you had to explain. It had been on the cover of Time and Newsweek. Politicians were using email. Schools were building computer labs. And every commercial break on television seemed to end with a website, .com, this .org, that. The web was everywhere. And for the first time, it was coming home. Not just to universities or office parks, but into kitchens, living rooms, and bedrooms. Onto desks cluttered with bills-framed photos and coffee cups. Into the rhythms of family life. America was logging on. If you bought a computer in 1996, it likely came with a modem and a trial disk for AOL or CompuServe. It booted up with a friendly chime. It ran Windows 95 or maybe 98. The monitor was bulky, the mouse had a ball inside, and the keyboard clicked loudly under your fingers. You placed it where there was space on the dining table in the guest room in the corner of the den. And once it was connected, once that buzzing modem finally reached its destination, you were part of something bigger. The Internet had arrived at home. At first, it was simple things. Sending an email to a cousin in another state, looking up movie times, searching for song lyrics, printing out driving directions. But soon, it became routine. You checked the weather online. You read headlines. You played games. Kids discovered Neopets Cartoon Network's homepage and educational websites filled with clip art and beeping sound effects. Parents found banking sites, health information, and forums where they could ask questions they would never ask aloud. And slowly, a shift began to happen. People were spending time online, not just minutes, but hours, nights, weekends, not working, not researching, just being there. The web had become a place to visit, and increasingly, a place to stay. That transformation was cultural as much as technological. The home computer, once a tool, became a portal, a way to explore, a way to connect. You did not have to leave the house to be somewhere else. And this mattered especially in small towns, in rural states, in neighborhoods far from bookstores or universities. The web was a library, a bulletin board, a jukebox, a pen pal, a classroom. It was whatever you needed it to be, and it was growing fast. Between 1996 and 1999, the number of Internet users in America more than tripled. The number of websites exploded from $100,000 to over 3 million. Search engines like Alta Vista Lycos and eventually Google helped users find their way. News portals like CNN.com brought breaking headlines to your screen. E-commerce matured. Amazon expanded beyond books. eBay turned everyone into a seller. Newegg Priceline and countless others offered things you did not even know you wanted. And for every service, there was a community forming around it. Chat rooms became gathering places, whether hosted by AOL, Yahoo, or IRC servers. Forums sprouted up for everything: car repair, poetry, parenting, gaming. People built personal websites on GeoCities and AngelFire, complete with blinking text and guest books. The phrase "internet friends" became common. At first, people said it cautiously, almost apologetically. "Oh, I know him," from online. But over time, it became a badge, a point of pride. You had people. You had connections. And sometimes, you had secrets. Because the internet at home was also private. It let people explore parts of themselves they had kept hidden. They joined support groups. They found others with the same questions, the same fears. They told the truth behind usernames. It was not all perfect. Scams appeared. Spam filled inboxes. Rumors spread quickly. Some chat rooms turned toxic. And yet, despite the messiness, there was something beautiful in the chaos. Because for every pop-up ad, there was a late-night message that made someone feel less alone. For every broken link, there was a new discovery. For every dial-up tone, there was the quiet knowledge that the world was waiting. And as the century wound to a close, you could feel the acceleration. You could see it in the hardware: faster processors, better modems, sharper screens. You could hear it in the conversation websites, replacing phone books, email, replacing letters. You could see it in the way kids did their homework, in the way parents read the news, in the way couples met, broke up, and reconnected online. The internet was no longer visiting the home. It had moved in. There was no ceremony, no clear boundary, just a slow accumulation of habits, of routines, of moments that now included a screen. And maybe on some quiet evening in 1999, someone sat down after dinner, checked their email, clicked through a few links, watched a loading bar inch across the screen, and smiled, because they were home, and also somehow everywhere. The dot-com boom, Silicon dreams, and startup frenzy. It is hard to overstate just how giddy the air felt in America during the late 1990s, if you happened to be within reach of a computer and an idea. Suddenly it seemed like the future had arrived, and it was dressed in HTML. The term .com was no longer a technical suffix. It became a dream, a lifestyle, even a lottery ticket. From around 1997 to early 2000, Silicon Valley became not just a region in California, but the symbol of something much bigger, a new kind of gold rush, this time made of code. Venture capital firms, once cautious and traditional, were throwing money at almost anything with a .com in its name. There was a real belief shared by founders, investors, and even news anchors that the rules of business had changed forever. You no longer needed profit, or even a solid plan. All you needed was a flashy website, a vague pitch about disrupting the industry, and preferably some ping-pong tables in the office. If you were a college dropout with a clever domain name, your chances of raising millions were surprisingly high. Companies like Pets.com, eToys, Cosmo, and Webvan became media darlings. Some of them spent tens of millions on Super Bowl ads before ever turning a profit. Some never sold a single thing. I remember reading a story back then, though I forget the name, about a startup that got funded based on nothing more than a PowerPoint presentation and a half-formed idea about online groceries. There was a genuine belief that everything, absolutely everything, would move online. Groceries, furniture, dog food, even therapy. But it was not just the startups. Big names were getting in on the act too. Yahoo, Amazon, eBay. All of them were young giants back then, each riding a tidal wave of excitement. They were hiring at a furious pace, building massive campuses, and promising the kind of workplace culture that made the traditional 9-to-5 look ancient. If you visited an office in Silicon Valley during that time, you would have found beanbags, espresso machines, and maybe even a meditation room. Suits were replaced by hoodies. Stock options were better than salaries. And the word IPO had taken on a kind of mythic power, like a modern-day coronation. Financial news was filled with tales of 20-somethings becoming millionaires overnight. High school kids were day trading between classes. Everyone, it seemed, had a hot tip. Stocks like Priceline.com, Infospace, and VA Linux were soaring. Analysts used terms like new economy and paradigm shift with straight faces. And yet, even in the midst of all this optimism, a few quiet voices were whispering caution. Warren Buffett, for example, famously stayed away from tech stocks altogether. Some journalists raised eyebrows at the sky-high valuations of companies that had never made a dollar. But those warnings were drowned out by the roar of a crowd convinced that the old rules no longer applied. In the fall of 1999, more than 300 internet companies had gone public. Some doubled or tripled in value within hours. It felt like gravity had been suspended. You could almost hear America holding its breath and saying, "This is it. This is the future." There is something uniquely American about that moment, a combination of optimism, innovation, and a little bit of madness. People truly believed they were witnessing the birth of a new civilization. And in a way, they were not entirely wrong, because underneath all the hype, there were real seeds being planted. Yes, a lot of companies were doomed from the start, but others, Google, Amazon, PayPal, were quietly building something solid. The chaos of the boom years helped lay the groundwork for the internet economy we know today. It is strange to think back on it now. The logos, the commercials, the strange surreal feeling that everything was speeding up. You could almost feel time stretching and twisting like a modem trying to connect. I still remember a billboard on the side of Highway 101 that just said, "This is the beginning." No company name, no product, just a statement of belief. And at that time, we believed. Not because we were naive necessarily, but because we were hopeful. Hopeful that technology could level the playing field, that a kid in Nebraska could build something that reached the world, that work could be fun, that change could be fast, that history for once might finally move in our favor. But as we would soon learn, even the future has to obey the laws of gravity. And that next chapter, when the wave broke, is something I will never forget. Dot-com bust, 2000-2001, the crash that shook tech. For a while, it looked like the party would never end. People were quitting their stable jobs to join startups. Taxi drivers were giving stock tips. The Nasdaq was climbing higher by the day, and everyone kept saying the same thing this time: it's different. But history has a habit of catching up, and when it does, it doesn't knock. It just kicks the door down. By the spring of 2000, the mood began to shift. The first cracks appeared when a few high-profile companies, ones that had once been media darlings, started missing their earnings targets. Investors who had once been willing to overlook the absence of profits suddenly got spooked. In March 2000, the Nasdaq peaked at over 5,000 points. It was a staggering figure, built almost entirely on promise and potential. Then, almost overnight, the market began to tumble. Stocks that had been worth hundreds of dollars were now worth pennies. Fortunes vanished. Dreams evaporated. The dot-com bubble had burst. You could feel the air go out of the room, especially in places like Silicon Valley. Office parks that had once been buzzing with energy now stood empty. Beanbags were replaced by bankruptcy papers. Startups that had burned through millions of dollars in marketing had nothing left to show. Pets.com, once the symbol of the new digital economy, shut down in November 2000, barely 9 months after its IPO. Its famous sock puppet mascot, which had starred in Super Bowl commercials, became a cautionary tale overnight. Webvan Cosmo eToys, and dozens of others followed. And it wasn't just the small players. Giants like Cisco, Intel, and Oracle saw their stock values sliced in half or worse. Venture capital dried up. IPOs vanished. The phrase burn rate became a dirty word. Employees who had once been paper millionaires now found their stock options were worthless. Some had even taken pay cuts for those options. The emotional whiplash was real. Just a year before, these people were on top of the world, changing the rules, rewriting the future. Now they were packing their desks, updating their resumes, and trying to figure out what had just happened. I remember stories of engineers applying for jobs at Starbucks not for the money, but just to have something steady. Others went back to grad school. Some simply disappeared, retreating into quiet corners of the country to lick their wounds. But the damage wasn't just psychological. The dot-com crash erased over $5 trillion in market value. Retirement funds were hit. Banks got nervous. And while the broader economy didn't collapse entirely, the tech sector entered a deep winter. Yet, and this is the strange part, not all was lost. In the rubble of the dot-com collapse, something interesting began to happen. The survivors' companies like Amazon, eBay, and Google began to consolidate power. They had weathered the storm, and now they faced far less competition. Their technologies had matured. Their business models had evolved, and they started building slowly, carefully, methodically. In retrospect, the crash served as a brutal filter. It washed away the hype and left behind the real builders. People who believed in the long haul. People who weren't chasing quick IPOs or flashy Super Bowl ads, but who were quietly laying the foundation of the internet economy we now take for granted. In 2001, a young company called Google was still mostly unknown. It had a clean homepage, a strange algorithm, and very little revenue. But it kept growing. Quietly, efficiently. Same with Amazon. It took a beating in the crash, but it survived. It pivoted, it adapted, and eventually, it re-emerged stronger than ever. It's easy to laugh at the dot-com era. Now the ridiculous company names the wild spending, the office scooters, and open bars. But buried in all that excess was something genuine. A belief that the internet could change the world. And maybe, just maybe, it did. The bust taught us something that America seems to forget every few decades. Hype is not the same as progress. But sometimes you need a little madness to get to the real thing. The dreamers may fall, but the dream keeps moving forward. And as the dust settled from the dot-com bust, a new wave of innovation was already forming, one that would look less like Wall Street and more like a college dorm room in Cambridge. But we will get to that in a moment. 2004-2006. The rise of social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. While the dot-com bust left many dazed, broke, and a little cynical, it also cleared the runway for something entirely new. The early 2000s were quieter, but not still. They were brewing with the kind of innovation that does not start with venture capital meetings. It starts in dorm rooms, garages, and with a sense that the internet was ready for something more human. In February 2004, a college sophomore named Mark Zuckerberg launched a website from his Harvard dorm. It was called The Facebook, and at first it was just for students at Harvard. A kind of online yearbook, but with a twist. You could friend people and peek into their profiles. In less than a month, thousands of Harvard students had joined. Soon after, students at Yale, Columbia, and Stanford were added. By the end of the year, it had spread to dozens of universities. There had been social networks before Friendster, MySpace, but Facebook had something different. It felt more personal, more exclusive, more real. It was not about flashy profiles with glittery text. It was about your actual social circle. And it was addictive. Meanwhile, in April 2005, 3 former PayPal employees uploaded a 19-second video titled "Me at the Zoo" to a brand new site called YouTube. It was not polished, it was not professional, but it felt raw, genuine, and oddly compelling. The idea was simple. Let people share videos online, no matter how short or weird. Within months, YouTube became a sensation. People posted skateboarding fails, wedding dances, cooking tutorials, and makeup reviews. Suddenly, the web was not just about reading or clicking. It was about performing, creating, participating. And in March 2006, something even stranger happened. A tiny team inside a podcasting startup launched a side project they called Twitter. It let you post short 140-character updates about what you were doing. It sounded ridiculous. Who would want to read someone's lunch update? Apparently, millions of people. By the end of that year, Twitter had taken root with early adopters, especially at tech conferences. Live tweeting became a thing. Hashtags were born. The world's thoughts were now streaming in real time, one micro-post at a time. Something profound was happening. These platforms were not just new websites. They were new ways of being. Suddenly, your online identity was not separate from your real life. It was your life. What you posted, who you followed, how many likes you got, it all started to shape your sense of self. For businesses, this was gold. Brands began opening Facebook pages. Musicians dropped YouTube videos instead of albums. Politicians tweeted instead of holding press conferences. And for everyday people, it felt like a revolution. A quiet one, a soft one, but a revolution nonetheless. You did not need a television network to be seen. You did not need a record deal to be heard. You just needed a phone and a Wi-Fi connection. The barriers to fame, to influence, to expression, they all started to crumble. And something else rose in its place. The idea that everyone could be a creator, a broadcaster, a brand. By the end of 2006, social media was no longer a trend. It was the new normal. And the ripple effects were only beginning. Because once people had a voice, they would not let go of it easily. And the platforms that gave them that voice would soon discover just how powerful and how dangerous that could be. Google and the search revolution. Before Google became a verb, the internet felt like a massive, cluttered attic. Sure, everything was technically there, but finding it, that was a whole different story. You had to sift through directories, click through sketchy web rings, or rely on the primitive search engines of the time. Ask Jeeves tried to make search conversational, but Jeeves never really knew what you were talking about. Then came two Stanford graduate students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. In 1998, they launched a search engine called Google from a garage in Menlo Park. It was fast, it was clean, and most importantly, it worked. Google's secret sauce was something called PageRank, a way of measuring how important a page was based on how many other pages linked to it. Instead of just matching keywords, Google used the logic of recommendation. If a page was frequently linked by others, it was probably valuable. Just like in real life, if enough people pointed to something, it became worth checking out. By the early 2000s, Google had become the default gateway to the internet. No matter what you were looking for, recipes, conspiracy theories, old song lyrics, Google got you there. And you never had to go past the first page. But the real magic happened when Google figured out how to make money from it. Enter AdWords launched in 2000. It allowed businesses to buy ads tied to specific search terms. Want to sell yoga mats? You could bid on the phrase yoga for beginners. Your ad would show up right next to the search results. It was targeted, efficient, and incredibly profitable. Google became a money machine almost overnight. And then came AdSense, which let everyday website owners display Google's ads and earn money when people clicked. Suddenly, everyone had an incentive to create content, drive traffic, and game the system. The age of blogs, clickbait, and SEO was born. Google did not just organize the web, it shaped it. Sites started writing headlines not for humans, but for algorithms. Content was optimized, not for clarity, but for visibility. But the trade-off seemed worth it. For users, Google was a miracle. You could type half a thought, and it would auto-complete the rest. You could find out anything instantly. No more encyclopedias. No more asking your older brother. For businesses, it was a revolution in marketing. No more billboards or magazine spreads. Just data-driven, precision-targeted ads delivered in milliseconds. And for Google, it meant dominance. The company branched out Gmail, Google Maps, Google Docs. It acquired YouTube in 2006 for $165 billion, a move that seemed huge at the time, but would soon look like a steal. By the mid-2000s, Google was not just a search engine. It was the backbone of how people navigated the digital world. You did not go online anymore. You Googled. The internet was no longer a library. It was a mirror. And Google held the frame. Every question you asked, every symptom, every secret, every stupid thing you typed at 2 a.m., it all flowed through one company. And while users marveled at the convenience, something else was quietly happening behind the scenes. Data. Lots and lots of data. What you searched, what you clicked, how long you lingered. Every move was tracked, stored, analyzed. The world had changed. Knowledge was no longer stored in books or brains. It was outsourced to a search bar. And if the early internet was about connection, this new era was about access. Fast, frictionless, and just one search away. The birth of the iPhone and mobile internet. For most of human history, if you wanted to access all of human knowledge, you had to be at a desk, maybe a library, maybe a glowing screen tethered to a wall. But then came January 9th, 2007. On that day, Steve Jobs walked onto the stage at the Macworld conference and held up what looked like just another phone. But it was not just a phone. It was an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator all in one device. The crowd cheered. Some were confused. Others saw the future. The iPhone was not the first smartphone. BlackBerry and Palm Pilot fans would remind you of that. But it was the first to bring the full power of the internet to your pocket in a way that felt magical. It was smooth, responsive. You could pinch and zoom with your fingers. You could browse real websites, not some stripped-down WAP versions. No stylus, no physical keyboard, just glass and gestures. At first it was limited. There was no app store, no 3G, no copy-paste. But even in its primitive form, the iPhone hinted at something big. The internet was about to go mobile, and that would change everything. Because once people had the web in their hands, they never wanted to let go. By 2008, Apple launched the App Store, and suddenly developers everywhere could build tools, games, and platforms that lived right on your phone. A new economy was born, one that did not need office buildings or storefronts, just an icon on a screen. Uber, Instagram, WhatsApp, Tinder. These were not websites, they were apps. And they only made sense in a world where the internet traveled with you in your pocket, in your car, on your walk to work. Mobile internet also changed how we thought about time. You no longer went online. You were always online. The web was no longer a destination. It was your environment. Waiting in line, scroll Twitter. On the toilet, check Reddit. Sitting in traffic, open Google Maps, reroute, and maybe fire off a few emails. The line between online and offline disappeared. The internet was not a place anymore. It was a presence. And with it came new rituals. Notifications became the new heartbeat. Swiping became a reflex. Autocorrect became a frenemy. Airplane mode became the closest thing we had to digital silence. But there was a darker side too. The mobile internet meant constant surveillance from apps that tracked your steps, to ones that listened for your wake word. Your phone became a sensor collecting data about your movement preferences and conversations. Every app wanted your location. Every service wanted your attention, and we gave it freely. The iPhone did not just change how we access the internet. It changed who controlled it. Suddenly, Apple and Google through iOS and Android became gatekeepers. They decided which apps could live, which could update, which could charge money. In 2007, the internet was still a wild frontier. By 2010, it had been domesticated, packaged into sleek little squares, on a touchscreen, filtered through app stores, and carried everywhere. The iPhone was the beginning of an era where the internet was not just something you used. It was something you carried, something you felt, and we never looked back. Cloud computing and the way we work. There was a time when files lived on floppy disks. Then they moved to CDs, then to USB drives. If you forgot your thumb drive at home, too bad, you were stuck. Collaboration meant emailing attachments back and forth with names like Final Draft, Real, Final, v7.doc. And then, the cloud came along. At first it sounded like marketing nonsense. What even is the cloud? Where is it? Why should you trust it? But slowly, almost without noticing, we all moved in. The cloud was not really in the sky. It was in massive data centers, rows of servers humming in the dark, guarded like Fort Knox. Amazon, Google, and Microsoft built digital empires on these invisible fortresses. What they offered was simple. Instead of saving your stuff on your computer, you could save it on theirs. Access it from anywhere. Share it instantly. Never lose it again. And just like that, the way we worked changed forever. Suddenly, you could open a document in Google Docs, and 5 people could edit it at once from 5 different cities. No version confusion, no endless email chains, just real-time collaboration, like magic. Dropbox made file sharing effortless. Slack turned office chatter into organized, searchable threads. Zoom turned conference rooms into video calls. And AWS Amazon Web Services quietly powered it all behind the scenes. Before the cloud, launching a startup meant buying servers, renting space, hiring IT. After the cloud, all you needed was a laptop and a credit card. It was the great democratization of computing. 2 kids in a dorm could launch the next billion-dollar company. A teacher in Nebraska could share lesson plans with a classroom in Nairobi. A freelancer could build a career from coffee shops hopping Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi. But it was not just startups and creatives who embraced the cloud. Big business saw the writing on the wall. Banks, hospitals, government agencies, everyone started migrating. Why run your own data center when someone else can do it better, cheaper, faster? Of course, there were trade-offs. You gave up control. Your data lived somewhere else. Maybe in Virginia, maybe in Ireland, maybe you had no idea. Outages could bring entire industries to a halt. A single misconfigured setting could expose millions of records. And yet the benefits were too great to ignore. Cloud computing made work portable, flexible, scalable. You no longer needed to be in an office or even on the same continent. All you needed was a login. And then came 2020. When the pandemic hit, the world went remote overnight. Offices emptied, laptops lit up. The cloud became the new office building. Zoom calls replaced meetings. Google Docs became the new whiteboard. Slack became the hallway. The cloud had been quietly reshaping work for years, but suddenly it was not optional. It was essential. And the way we worked, how we collaborated, how we shared, how we showed up, was changed forever. The 2010s, streaming digital culture, fake news and moderation. If the 2000s were about building the internet, the 2010s were about living in it. By this point, the web was no longer a tool. It was a lifestyle. We streamed our shows. We shared our meals. We swiped for love. The internet had become the central nervous system of American culture, and nothing captured this shift more than streaming. Netflix, once a mail-order DVD company, went all in on digital. In 2013, it released House of Cards, its first original series. No commercials, no waiting week to week, just an entire season dropped at once. America binged, and the game changed. Soon streaming became the norm. Hulu, Amazon Prime, then Disney Plus, then HBO Max. Cable subscriptions plummeted. The remote control gathered dust. The new question was not what's on TV, but what platform is it on? And it was not just TV. Spotify turned music into an endless buffet. YouTube became the new classroom, the new stage, the new diary. Twitch turned gaming into a spectator sport. TikTok compressed creativity into 15 seconds. The culture no longer trickled down, it went viral. But with virality came velocity. News spread fast. Misinformation spread faster. Suddenly everyone was a publisher, and the old filters, editors, fact-checkers, deadlines were gone. The line between truth and rumor blurred. In 2016, fake news was no longer a punchline. It was an election issue. False stories got more engagement than real ones. Bots pushed conspiracy theories. Troll farms targeted vulnerable voters. And social media platforms struggled to respond. Facebook introduced fact-checking. Twitter flagged tweets. YouTube adjusted its algorithm. But the damage was done. Trust in media fractured. Echo chambers hardened. And reality itself felt negotiable. Meanwhile, moderation became a battlefield. What counted as harmful? Who got to decide? Was a platform a neutral stage, or a publisher with responsibility? Reddit banned hate subreddits. Twitter banned political ads. Facebook banned, well, sometimes. Every decision sparked outrage. Someone always felt censored. Someone else felt ignored. And behind it all was the algorithm. Invisible, powerful, addictive. It decided what you saw, what you clicked, what you believed. It learned your habits. It shaped your moods. It whispered constantly, here's what to feel. Here's what to buy. Here's who to be mad at. The internet of the 2010s was not just a place to visit. It was the place you lived, where you worked, laughed, fought, and felt. It was the mall, the newspaper, the therapist, the best friend, the worst enemy. It connected us, entertained us, manipulated us, divided us. And as we approached the end of the decade, one thing was clear. The internet was no longer just changing America. It was defining it. COVID-19 and the year the internet became real life. It started with headlines from far away. Then airports got quiet. Then offices, then schools, then everything. By March 2020, America shut down. The streets emptied. The silence was eerie. But online, it was louder than ever. The internet, once a luxury, became lifeline. Work online, school online, church online, birthday parties, happy hours, funerals, everything moved to the screen. Suddenly, that quiet rectangle in your pocket became the entire world. Zoom went from obscure tool to household verb. Let's Zoom replaced. Let's meet. Teachers turned bedrooms into classrooms. Parents juggled math lessons and microwave lunches. Kids learned to mute and unmute. Sort of. Doctors saw patients through webcams. Therapists counseled through earbuds. Court hearings happened over Wi-Fi. Even Congress logged in. We stopped commuting. We stopped hugging. We started staring at each other through tiny windows on screens. And the digital divide became painfully clear. For families with fast internet and new devices, remote life was hard. For those without, it was nearly impossible. Students fell behind. Workers missed shifts. Entire communities disconnected. Meanwhile, the internet became our coping mechanism. We baked sourdough. We watched Tiger King. We danced on TikTok. We panic-bought toilet paper online, of course. And we grieved. We lost people, rituals, moments. Funerals streamed on Facebook, weddings postponed to live streams, hugs replaced with heart emojis. But through it all, the internet held us together. We clapped for nurses on Instagram. We sent groceries through apps. We FaceTimed grandparents. We played online games just to feel less alone. In 2020, the internet stopped being a place we visited. It became the place we lived, full-time. The line between digital and physical blurred completely. Reality was filtered through screens. Connection was redefined. Presence meant bandwidth. And somehow we adapted. We built routines around Wi-Fi. We found joy in memes. We fell in love through DMs. We cried into cameras. We hit leave meeting and sat in silence. That year, the internet became more than technology. It became home, church, school, office, playground, therapist. It became the beating heart of a society in pause. And when the world slowly began to reopen, we did not quite leave it behind. The habits stayed. The Zoom links, the Slack pings, the online yoga classes, the sense that this strange digital existence was not temporary anymore. It was just life now. When the internet became America's memory, somewhere along the way, without ceremony or warning, the internet became our memory. Not just a tool, not just a mirror, but the place where everything lived. Every birthday photo, every text from a loved one, every song we cried to at midnight, every recipe we tried and burned, every half-finished blog, every draft email, every tweet we thought was clever at the time. It is all still there. Our first jobs, our first heartbreaks, our first usernames. The photos we forgot we uploaded. The statuses we never thought would matter. A decade of life frozen in code, and not just ours. The internet became the memory of a country. Footage of protests, videos of speeches, threads of outrage, hashtags of solidarity, mistakes and miracles all preserved. Moments that once lived and faded, now live forever. Whether we want them to or not. A photo from high school becomes a reunion catalyst. A post from 2009 resurfaces in a job interview. A viral video becomes a movement. A meme becomes a symbol. A typo becomes a legacy. We used to forget. Now we archive. We used to remember what mattered. Now we remember everything. And as America continues to evolve, shift, argue, grow, stumble, dance, and rebuild the internet records it all. Somewhere on a server farm in the Arizona desert, your childhood blog still sits. Somewhere in the cloud, a blurry video of your dad grilling that one summer afternoon is still waiting to be opened. Somewhere in a folder no one has clicked in years, your first draft of that novel still waits. The internet remembers even when we forget. It remembers the music of our youth, the chaos of our news feeds, the weirdness of our Google searches, the hope in our Kickstarter dreams, and maybe that is its final transformation. From battlefield to classroom, from phone line to lifeline, from distraction to home, and finally from invention to inheritance. Because the internet is no longer just a thing we use. It is the diary we never meant to write, the photo album we never meant to fill, the time capsule we built by accident. And one day when someone asks what it felt like to be American in the age of the internet, what we dreamed of, what we feared, what we found funny, what we chose to share, all they will have to do is look it up.